For more of this kind of content, you can subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave a comment. The twin moons of Zyralos cast a cold, silver glow across the vast alien landscape as Robert stepped off the transport ship. His boots crunched against the metallic sands, the air sharp with the tang of ozone and the faint hum of bioelectric energy that seemed to permeate the planet. This was a world unlike any he'd ever seen, vast, crystalline forests, glimmering like frozen oceans, and rivers of molten light carving their way through jagged, blue-hued mountains. Zyralos was home to the Zynthari, a race of fearsome humanoids with deep blue skin and a reputation for their warlike ways. Robert, a human researcher with an insatiable curiosity for the unknown, had been handpicked for this assignment, a bold initiative to study and foster relations with the Zynthari. His colleagues had called it a fool's mission, but Robert thrived on the impossible. As he adjusted his pack, the Zynthari delegation approached. At their head was a towering figure whose presence stole the air from the surrounding space, Jennifer. She moved with the predatory grace of a panther, her braided blonde hair glinting in the moonlight. Her black eyes locked onto him with an intensity that made his spine tingle. Even in the thick cloak of her battle uniform, her striking features and perfectly sculpted frame were impossible to ignore. "You're the human," she stated, her voice low and commanding, as though it wasn't a question but an accusation. "And you must be Jennifer," Robert replied, meeting her gaze without flinching. "My babysitter, I presume?" Her lips curled into a tight smirk, though her eyes narrowed. "If I'm your babysitter, you're the infant who wandered too far from his cradle." The other Zynthari chuckled, but Robert remained unfazed. He simply shouldered his pack and grinned. "Good thing I'm not easily intimidated." Jennifer's smirk faltered. There was something about this human. His confidence bordered on arrogance, but it wasn't born of ignorance. He seemed to enjoy the tension, as if he thrived on her annoyance. She turned on her heel, her voice clipped. "Follow me. Keep up or get left behind." Robert's grin widened. "Yes, ma'am." The Zynthari base was a masterpiece of alien engineering. Towering spires of bioluminescent crystal pulsed with energy, while winding pathways suspended mid-air seemed to defy gravity. Robert's gaze darted around, taking in every detail with the wonder of a child and the precision of a scientist. Jennifer, however, was less impressed. "You're gawking," she snapped as they walked through a corridor that spiraled upward. "Try to act like you've seen advanced civilizations before." He glanced at her, his smirk firmly in place. "Forgive me if your architectural genius leaves me speechless." Her sharp retort was on the tip of her tongue when a faint whiff of his scent reached her, earthy, musky, and distinctly human. It was subtle, but it tugged at her senses like an invisible thread. She stiffened, her pace quickening. Robert noticed. "Something wrong?" "Focus on your work," she barked, refusing to meet his gaze. "Touchy," he murmured under his breath, though he couldn't suppress his amusement. Despite her frosty demeanor, there was a fire in her that intrigued him, and perhaps a part of him wanted to see just how far he could push her. By the third day of their interactions, the friction between them had grown into an almost tangible force. Jennifer found herself increasingly aware of Robert's presence, his movements, his voice, and most annoyingly, his scent. It lingered in the air, invading her thoughts and weakening her resolve. During one of their routine inspections of a Zynthari artifact, a massive, glowing sphere that pulsed with ancient energy, Robert leaned closer than necessary to examine the intricate carvings on its surface. His shoulder brushed hers, and a jolt of warmth shot through her. "Fascinating," he said, his tone low. "The energy signatures are unlike anything I've ever seen." Jennifer swallowed hard, her pulse quickening. "You're invading my space, human." He glanced at her, his black eyes smoldering with curiosity. "Am I?" "Yes," she snapped, stepping away. But the distance didn't ease the tension. If anything, it made her more acutely aware of the way her body reacted to him. For the first time in her life, Jennifer felt out of control, and it infuriated her. She was a warrior, a protector of her people. She did not falter, and she certainly didn't let a human disrupt her focus. But Robert was no ordinary human, and the more she tried to ignore him, the more her thoughts betrayed her. The storm hit without warning. Lightning forked across the sky, and winds howled like feral beasts. The Zynthari base was too far to reach before the worst of it descended, leaving Robert and Jennifer no choice but to seek shelter in a nearby cave. The space was cramped, and the storm's fury outside made conversation nearly impossible. Jennifer sat rigidly against the stone wall, her jaw tight as she struggled to ignore the human, sitting just a few feet away. But the confined space amplified everything: his scent, his steady breathing, the faint hum of his energy. Robert, ever the provocateur, broke the silence. "You know, for someone so eager to avoid me, you're awfully close." She glared at him, her voice low and dangerous. "You're testing my patience." "Am I?" he asked, leaning back casually. "Or is it something else?" Her fists clenched. "What are you implying?" He met her gaze, his tone soft but unyielding. "I think you're more affected by me than you'd like to admit." Her breath hitched, and for a moment, her composure cracked. The storm outside seemed to echo the turmoil inside her, each bolt of lightning illuminating the unspoken tension between them. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and vulnerability. "Your scent has mesmerized me, human, and I hate it." Robert leaned closer, his black eyes burning with intensity. "Then stop fighting it." Jennifer's resolve wavered as the storm raged on, and for the first time, she wondered if surrendering might not be the worst thing after all. The cave was alive with sound, the relentless roar of the storm outside, and the steady crackle of an energy field that pulsed faintly in the walls. But inside, the silence between Robert and Jennifer was far more deafening. Jennifer's fists rested on her knees, clenched so tightly that her knuckles had turned a darker shade of blue. Her breathing was measured, yet uneven, as she stared at the ground. She couldn't bring herself to look at Robert, who leaned casually against the opposite wall, his confident smirk more disarming than ever. "You're unusually quiet," Robert said, breaking the silence. His tone was light, teasing even, but there was an undercurrent of curiosity in his voice. "I didn't think that was possible for someone like you." Her eyes snapped up, glaring daggers. "Someone like me? You know," he replied, waving a hand vaguely. "Stoic, fierce, completely immune to emotions." Her jaw tightened. "Emotions make you weak. I have no use for them." "That's funny," Robert mused, tapping a finger against his temple as if in thought. "Because you seem pretty emotional right now." Jennifer shot to her feet, her imposing figure casting a shadow over him as she stepped closer. "You have no idea what you're talking about, human." Robert's smirk didn't falter, even as her voice dipped into a dangerous growl. Instead, he stood slowly, meeting her gaze with unshakable confidence. "Don't I?" Jennifer's breath caught. He was close, too close. Her eyes flicked to his hand, which rested casually against the cave wall beside her. His scent, stronger now in the confined space, wrapped around her like a heated shroud, making it impossible to think clearly. "I'm warning you," she said, though her voice had lost some of its bite. "Back off." Robert tilted his head, studying her with maddening calmness. "You're not used to this, are you?" Her brows furrowed. "Used to what? This?" He gestured between them, his voice dropping into a softer, more intimate tone. "Feeling something you can't control." Jennifer stiffened, her breath coming in short bursts. "You're delusional." "Am I?" He pressed, stepping even closer. His voice was calm, but relentless, like a tide wearing away at a stubborn rock. "Then why are you trembling?" She opened her mouth to retort, but the words died on her lips as he reached out, his fingers brushing against her arm. The touch was light, almost hesitant, but it sent a shiver down her spine. Her black eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, she felt completely exposed. "You're infuriating," she finally managed, her voice a whisper. "And you're fascinating," he countered, his tone equally soft. "I think that makes us even." Jennifer's mind raced. She should push him away, assert her dominance, remind him of his place. But instead, she found herself standing still, her body betraying her with its longing to close the distance between them. "Why do you do this?" Jennifer asked suddenly, her voice sharper than she intended. "Why do you insist on provoking me?" Robert leaned back slightly, though his gaze never wavered. "Because I want to understand you." Her laugh was bitter, hollow. "Understand me? You're a human. You could never understand what it means to be Zynthari. Then help me," he said simply. "Explain it to me." She hesitated, caught off guard by the sincerity in his voice. "Why would you care?" "Because you're not just some warrior," Robert said, his voice low but firm. "You're not just another alien. You're Jennifer, and I can see there's more to you than the walls you built." Jennifer turned away, her arms crossing defensively over her chest. "You speak as if you know me." "I don't," he admitted, taking a step closer. "But I want to." She shot him a sidelong glance, her expression unreadable. "And why is that?" Robert smiled faintly, his voice softening. "Because you're not what I expected. You're strong, intelligent, and honestly, pretty terrifying. But you're also complicated, and I think you hate that I see it." Jennifer's fists clenched at her sides. He wasn't wrong. She did hate it. Hated how easily he peeled back the layers she'd spent years perfecting. But more than that, she hated how much she wanted him to see her, to understand her. "You don't know what you're asking," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the storm. "Then show me," Robert said, stepping into her line of sight. "Help me understand. Or is the great Jennifer afraid of being vulnerable?" Her gaze snapped to his, her black eyes burning with a mix of anger and something deeper, something she couldn't quite name. "You have no idea what you're doing, human." "Maybe not," he admitted, his voice low and steady. "But I'm not walking away." The tension between them was a living thing, pulsing in the space that separated their bodies. Jennifer's chest rose and fell with rapid breaths as she fought the conflicting emotions swirling within her. Her instincts screamed at her to maintain control, but Robert's unrelenting gaze stripped her of every defense. "Your scent," she began, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. "It's maddening. Every time you're near, it overwhelms me. I can't think straight. I can't focus." Robert's lips curved into a slow, knowing smile. "So, it's not just me then." She glared at him, her cheeks flushing a darker shade of blue. "This isn't a joke." "I'm not laughing," he said, his tone serious now. "But you don't have to fight this alone." Jennifer shook her head, her braids swaying with the motion. "You don't understand. I've spent my entire life perfecting control, and now, because of you, it's slipping away." "Maybe control isn't the answer," Robert said, his voice gentle but firm. "Maybe letting go is." Her eyes searched his, desperate for anything to hold on to. "You don't know what you're asking of me." Robert took another step forward, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "Maybe not, but I know what I'm offering. A chance to stop running. A chance to just feel." Jennifer's breath caught as his words sank in. For the first time, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that he might be right, that maybe strength wasn't about resisting, but about embracing the chaos. Her voice was barely a whisper when she finally spoke. "You're impossible. And you're unforgettable," Robert replied, his hand sliding down to lightly grasp hers. "So, where does that leave us?" Jennifer stared at their entwined hands, her heart pounding in her chest. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I think I want to find out." The storm outside had finally begun to wane, its fury giving way to a soft, rhythmic drizzle that echoed faintly in the cave. But inside, a different storm raged, a tempest of emotions, desires, and unspoken words. Jennifer sat on a makeshift seat of smooth stone, her posture rigid as she stared into the faint glow of an energy lamp they'd salvaged from her gear. Across from her, Robert leaned against the wall, his dark eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin flush. She could feel his gaze as surely as if it were a physical touch, and it both infuriated and intrigued her. "You're staring again," she said without looking at him, her voice sharper than she intended. "Can you blame me?" Robert replied smoothly, his lips curving into that maddeningly confident smirk. "You're fascinating to look at." Her cheeks darkened, a deep sapphire flush spreading over her high cheekbones. "Humans and their pointless flattery." "It's not flattery if it's true," he countered, pushing off the wall and crossing the small space to sit beside her. He moved with a quiet confidence, his proximity sending a ripple of tension through the air. "Why is it so hard for you to accept a compliment?" Jennifer turned to him, her black eyes narrowing. "Because compliments are distractions, and I don't need distractions." "Maybe you do," he said, his voice softer now. "Maybe it's okay to let yourself be distracted." Her lips parted, a sharp retort ready, but the words didn't come. Instead, she found herself staring at him, at the way the dim light carved shadows across his angular features, at the way his eyes seemed to pull her in. She could feel the heat of his body, the faint scent of him, stirring something primal within her. "This is dangerous," she murmured, more to herself than to him. Robert's gaze didn't waver. "Why? Because I'm human? Or because you feel it too?" Her breath hitched, and for a moment, she was at a loss. "You're insufferable. And you're impossible," he shot back, leaning just slightly closer. His voice dropped to a near whisper, intimate and unrelenting. "But that hasn't stopped either of us." Jennifer tried to ignore the way her pulse quickened as Robert's hand brushed against hers. It was a fleeting touch, but it lingered in her mind, as if his fingers had left a trail of fire on her skin. She pulled her hand away quickly, folding her arms across her chest, but the damage was done. "You don't know what you're doing," she said, her voice trembling slightly despite her efforts to steady it. "Don't I?" he asked, his tone light but probing. "You keep saying that, but here we are. You could have thrown me out of this cave hours ago, but you didn't. Why?" Jennifer's jaw tightened. She wanted to tell him he was wrong, that his words were meaningless, but she couldn't. Instead, she looked away, her gaze fixed on the flickering light of the energy lamp. "I don't trust you," she said finally, though the words felt hollow. "Maybe," Robert said, his voice gentle now, almost teasing, "but you're not afraid of me either, and that's what scares you." Her head snapped back to him, her black eyes wide with shock, and something else, something deeper, more vulnerable. "You think you know me so well?" "I don't," he admitted, "but I know what I see. And what I see is someone who's spent her whole life trying to prove she's untouchable, but you're not." Jennifer's breath caught as his words cut through her defenses like a blade. She hated how easily he disarmed her, how effortlessly he saw through the walls she'd built. But more than that, she hated how much she wanted to let those walls fall. The cave grew quieter as the rain outside slowed to a gentle patter. The air between them, however, was anything but calm. Robert shifted slightly, his shoulder brushing hers, and she didn't move away this time. The contact was subtle, but it set her nerves alight. "You're too close," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" he asked, his tone low and velvety. "Because you haven't moved." Her heart pounded in her chest as she turned to face him, her black eyes locking onto his. "You think you're clever, don't you?" He smiled, leaning in just enough for her to feel the warmth of his breath. "I think you're not telling me to stop." Jennifer's hands clenched at her sides, her body tense with the war raging within her. She wanted to push him away, to remind him and herself that this was forbidden. But the pull between them was undeniable, a magnetic force that neither could resist. "You're infuriating," she whispered, her voice trembling with both frustration and longing. "And you're intoxicating," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper, "even when you're trying to scare me away." For a moment, the world outside the cave ceased to exist. All Jennifer could see, all she could feel, was him. The sharp angles of his face, the fire in his dark eyes, the way his presence seemed to consume the space around her. "Robert," she began, her voice faltering as he leaned in, his lips hovering just a breath away from hers. "Tell me to stop," he murmured, his voice a low, intimate challenge. "And I will." Her heart raced as the words hung between them. She wanted to say it, to put an end to the dangerous game they were playing, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she found herself leaning closer, her breath mingling with his, her resolve crumbling. Before she could stop herself, Jennifer closed the distance between them, her lips brushing his in a kiss that was as hesitant as it was electric. The moment their skin touched, a surge of heat coursed through her, igniting something she hadn't known she was capable of feeling. Robert responded immediately, his hands coming up to gently cup her face, his touch firm yet tender. The kiss deepened, their breaths quickening as the tension that had built between them for days finally broke. Jennifer pulled back abruptly, her black eyes wide with shock and something else, something raw and unguarded. We can't." Robert's gaze was steady, his hands still resting lightly on her cheeks. "But we did." She shook her head, her braids swaying with the motion. "This goes against everything I've been taught. Maybe it's time to stop living by what you've been taught," he said, his voice soft but unyielding, "and start living by what you feel." Jennifer stared at him, her mind racing, her body still tingling from the kiss. She knew he was right, but accepting it would mean unraveling everything she'd built her life around. And yet, in that moment, with the storm outside, fading into silence, she couldn't bring herself to pull away. Instead, she whispered the only truth she could manage. "You're going to ruin me, human." Robert smiled faintly, his thumb brushing against her cheek. "Maybe, but I think you're worth it." The quiet after the storm was oppressive, yet it only seemed to amplify the charged atmosphere inside the cave. Jennifer sat on the cold stone floor, her head in her hands as if to steady herself. she could still feel the lingering warmth of Robert's lips on hers, a sensation that had left her both exhilarated and utterly undone. Robert crouched a few feet away, watching her with a mixture of caution and tenderness. He wasn't sure whether to give her space or to close the distance again, but one thing was clear. Something between them had irrevocably shifted. "You're quiet again," Robert said finally, his voice soft. "Should I be worried?" Jennifer's head snapped up, her piercing black eyes narrowing. "You shouldn't have done that." "You kissed me first," he reminded her, though his tone was devoid of smugness. It was a simple statement of fact. "I shouldn't have done that," she corrected, her voice filled with frustration. "It was a mistake." Robert leaned back on his heels, studying her. "Was it?" he asked, his voice calm but insistent. "Because it didn't feel like one to me." Jennifer let out a sharp exhale, her fists clenching at her sides. "You don't understand what's at stake. For me. For both of us." "Then explain it to me," Robert said, inching closer. "Help me understand why something that feels so right is wrong." Jennifer turned her head away, her jaw tight. "I'm a Zynthari warrior. I've been trained to follow orders, to adhere to our laws and customs. And our laws are clear. No connections with outsiders, especially not humans. And yet," Robert said gently, his voice laced with a quiet challenge, "here we are." Jennifer's shoulders slumped, a rare crack in her usually unshakable composure. "You think this is easy for me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I've spent my entire life proving I'm stronger, smarter, better than anyone who doubted me. And now, because of you, I'm questioning everything." Robert's expression softened. "You don't have to do this alone." She laughed bitterly, shaking her head. "You don't get it, Robert. If anyone finds out about this about us, they'll brand me a traitor. They'll exile me, or worse." "That's not fair," Robert said, his voice firm. "You've given everything to your people, and they'd turn on you because of how you feel." Jennifer's gaze snapped to his, anger flashing in her eyes. "It's not about fairness. It's about survival. The Zynthari see emotions as a weakness. If they see me with you, they'll think I've compromised myself, that I've compromised them." Robert leaned closer, his voice low and steady. "And do you think you've compromised yourself?" Jennifer hesitated, her black eyes searching his for something she couldn't name. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've never felt like this before. It's terrifying." Robert reached out, his hand brushing against hers. She flinched at the contact, but didn't pull away. "It doesn't have to be," he said softly. "You're not weak because you feel something, Jennifer. You're strong because you're willing to face it." Her chest tightened at his words, the sincerity in his voice cutting through the fear and doubt that had been swirling inside her. She wanted to believe him, to let herself embrace the emotions she'd been suppressing, but a lifetime of discipline and control wasn't so easily undone. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of their unspoken words filling the space between them. Jennifer's breathing slowed as she tried to collect herself, but the heat of Robert's presence was impossible to ignore. "You're relentless," she said finally, her voice tinged with both frustration and admiration. Robert smiled faintly. "I've been called worse." Jennifer turned to face him, her black eyes softening. "You don't give up, do you?" "Not when something's worth fighting for," he said, his gaze steady. "And you are." Her breath caught, and she looked away, her heart pounding. "You shouldn't say things like that." "Why not?" Robert asked, his tone gentle but insistent. "Because you're afraid it might be true?" Jennifer's head snapped back to him, her expression a mixture of anger and vulnerability. "Stop doing that." "Doing what?" "Looking at me like that," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. Like I'm not the enemy." "You're not the enemy," Robert said, leaning closer. His voice was quiet but firm, each word carrying weight. "You're Jennifer, and you're incredible." Her lips parted, but no words came. Instead, she found herself leaning closer, the magnetic pull between them growing stronger with each passing second. When their faces were just inches apart, she stopped, her gaze flicking to his lips and back to his eyes. "This is madness," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Maybe," Robert murmured, his breath brushing against her skin. "But it's our madness." With that, the distance between them disappeared. Their lips met in a kiss that was both tender and searing, a collision of passion and vulnerability. Jennifer's hands found their way to his shoulders, gripping them tightly as if to anchor herself. Robert's fingers brushed against her cheek, his touch sending shivers down her spine. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The storm outside was a distant memory, the rules and expectations of their worlds forgotten. All that mattered was the connection between them, the raw and undeniable chemistry that neither could resist. When they finally broke apart, their foreheads rested against each other, their breathing heavy. "Tell me this isn't real," Robert said softly, his voice tinged with both awe and defiance. Jennifer closed her eyes, her chest rising and falling as she tried to steady herself. "I can't," she admitted, "because it is." They sat in silence, their foreheads still touching, as the reality of their situation began to sink in. Jennifer was the first to pull back, her black eyes meeting Robert's. "If we do this," she said, her voice low but firm, "there's no going back. You understand that, don't you?" Robert nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I understand." Her lips pressed into a thin line as she studied him. "You're risking everything." "So are you," he countered, "but some things are worth the risk." Jennifer's heart clenched at his words, and for the first time, she allowed herself to hope. "Then we'll face it together." Robert smiled, his hand reaching out to clasp hers. Together. As the rain outside slowed to a soft drizzle, the two of them sat side by side, their hands intertwined. The path ahead was uncertain and fraught with danger, but for the first time, neither of them felt alone. The gentle drizzle outside was short-lived. The storm had subsided, but its aftershocks rippled within Jennifer and Robert, who sat side by side in a silence that was anything but calm. The electric tension from their shared moment lingered in the air, and neither dared to break it. But the universe had a way of throwing chaos into fragile peace. Jennifer's communicator crackled to life, a sharp voice cutting through the quiet. "Warrior Jennifer, report. You've been off the grid for too long. Status?" Her body stiffened, the cold reality of her world crashing back. She snatched the device from her belt and turned her back to Robert, her voice clipped and professional. "Storm interference. We're fine. Returning to base shortly." "Good," the voice replied, its tone suspicious. "The Council expects your full report upon arrival. Don't delay." The connection cut, leaving the cave eerily silent once more. Jennifer turned slowly, her expression guarded, her eyes darker than he'd ever seen them. "You should leave now," she said, her voice devoid of the vulnerability she'd shown just moments ago. Robert leaned forward, his brows furrowed. "Leave? What are you talking about?" "You don't understand," she snapped, her tone sharper than intended. "If the Council finds out about this about us, it won't just be my life on the line. They'll come for you too. And you think I'm afraid of them?" Robert said, his voice steady but low. "I'm not." "You should be," Jennifer replied, stepping closer. "The Zynthari Council doesn't tolerate weakness, and they'll see our connection as a threat. To them, you're a contaminant, something to be removed." Robert's jaw tightened, his dark eyes blazing. "I'm not going anywhere. If you're in danger, I'm staying." Jennifer's lips parted as if to argue, but a sound outside the cave froze her in place, a faint rustling, unnatural in the stillness. Her head snapped toward the entrance, her senses heightened. "Stay here," she whispered, her tone urgent. Without waiting for a response, she drew the sleek, curved blade from her hip and moved toward the cave mouth, her movements silent and deliberate. Robert, of course, didn't stay put. He followed a few steps behind her, his curiosity outweighing his common sense. Jennifer shot him a glare over her shoulder, but didn't have time to argue. The rustling grew louder, accompanied by the faint hum of an energy field, a sound Robert recognized from his time observing Zynthari tech. Jennifer pressed herself against the rocky wall, peering into the dense underbrush outside the cave. Her pulse quickened as she spotted them 3 Zynthari enforcers, clad in black armor that absorbed the moonlight, their weapons glowing faintly with deadly energy. "They're tracking us," she hissed under her breath. Robert stepped closer, his voice low. "How did they find us?" Jennifer's jaw tightened. "They must have followed our trail during the storm. They're here to monitor me, or worse." Robert frowned. "So, what's the plan?" "The plan," she said, her eyes flashing, "is for you to stay hidden while I deal with them. And let you face them alone? Not a chance." Jennifer turned to him, her frustration evident. "This isn't a negotiation. If they find you, they'll kill you on sight." Robert met her gaze, his voice calm but unyielding. "Then I guess we'd better make sure they don't." Jennifer didn't have time to argue further. The enforcers were closing in, their weapons humming louder as they moved through the underbrush. She crouched low, her blade glinting in the moonlight, and motioned for Robert to stay back. To her mild surprise and irritation, He obeyed, though she could see the tension in his stance. As the first enforcer stepped into view, Jennifer struck with the precision of a predator. Her blade sliced through the air, catching the soldier off guard. He stumbled back, his weapon falling from his grasp as Jennifer spun, delivering a swift kick to his chest that sent him sprawling. The other two enforcers reacted instantly, raising their weapons and firing bursts of energy. Jennifer darted to the side, her movements impossibly fast, but she was outnumbered, and their coordination was impeccable. "Jennifer," Robert called out, his voice tinged with alarm. He watched as one of the enforcers flanked her, raising his weapon for a point-blank shot. Without thinking, Robert grabbed a jagged stone from the ground and hurled it with all his strength. The makeshift projectile struck the enforcer square in the face, disrupting his aim and giving Jennifer the opening she needed. She moved like lightning, her blade slicing through his armor with lethal precision. The final enforcer turned his attention to Robert, raising his weapon. Jennifer's heart lurched as she realized she wouldn't reach him in time. "Get down!" she shouted. Robert dropped to the ground just as the enforcer fired. The energy blast scorched the cave wall behind him, narrowly missing his head. Jennifer lunged, her blade flashing, and dispatched the final enforcer with a ferocity that left no room for doubt. She was protecting what was hers. The silence that followed was deafening. Jennifer stood over the bodies of the enforcers, her chest heaving, her blade dripping with the faintly glowing blood of her own kind. She wiped it clean on her armor before turning to Robert, who was still crouched on the ground. "You're insane," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and relief. "You could have been killed." "So could you," Robert shot back, rising to his feet. "I wasn't going to just sit here and do nothing." Jennifer closed the distance between them, her black eyes blazing. "You don't understand what you've done. They'll know I killed them. They'll send more. Then we'll deal with it," Robert said, his voice calm but firm. "Together." Her breath hitched at the word, and for a moment, she felt the weight of everything she'd been trying to suppress. He wasn't just a human researcher anymore. He was her ally, her partner, and maybe something more. "You're going to ruin me," she whispered, echoing her earlier words. Robert stepped closer, his hand brushing against her cheek. "Or maybe I'll save you." Jennifer's eyes softened, and she let herself lean into his touch for the briefest of moments before pulling away. "We need to move," she said, her voice steady once more. "If we stay here, they'll send reinforcements." Robert nodded, his expression serious. "Then lead the way." As they disappeared into the shadows of the forest, the bodies of the enforcers lay forgotten, their presence a grim reminder of the danger that now surrounded them. But for Jennifer and Robert, the path ahead was clear. Survival. Together. The forest swallowed them whole, its towering crystalline trees casting fractured light across their path. Jennifer led the way, her every movement sharp and deliberate, but her mind was a storm of contradictions. Behind her, Robert followed, his silence heavy with unspoken determination. After what felt like hours, they stopped at the edge of a glowing ravine, the molten river below casting eerie reflections on their faces. Jennifer turned to him, her expression unreadable. "You could still leave," she said, her voice softer than before. "They'll come for us, Robert, for me. You don't have to be part of this." Robert stepped closer, his dark eyes holding hers with unwavering intensity. "I made my choice back in that cave. You don't get to push me away now." Her chest tightened at his words, the weight of their meaning pressing down on her. She reached out, her hand brushing his, and for a moment, their fingers entwined in unspoken promise in the chaos of their reality. "They'll call this treason," Jennifer whispered, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "But for the first time, I don't care." Robert smiled faintly, his voice steady. "Then let them come." As the glowing forest pulsed faintly around them, Jennifer allowed herself a small, defiant smile. The path ahead was perilous, but for the first time, she wasn't walking it alone. The hunt had begun, but so had their rebellion. Together, they would face the shadows and perhaps carve a future no one could have foreseen. To be continued.